construction.
Tonight's piece is part 5 of a 9-part show about the physical and mental abuse Gerry encountered as a child, and his Uncle Bill and others who intervened and saved him from a life of violence and paralysis. Please welcome Gerry Courtney.
Thank you. Thank you. In the middle of 10th grade, I moved from a poverty-stricken part of Detroit to a poverty-stricken dirt road in a place called Novi, Michigan, which is about 40 minutes north of Detroit. The road had about 15 dilapidated homes. And what made our home stand out was that we were the only ones that didn't have a broken down snowmobile, sailboat, truck, car, dirt bike, well, you get the idea. So on this dirt road, there were hardly any kids. The only kids I met were in Novi High School, a small school, a lot smaller than the one I knew in Detroit, but was a lot safer. And there was one guy that stood out for me through all the kids that I met. His name was John Van Wagner. And John was what they called Novi's Renaissance man. You can imagine how small and tiny Novi is to have a 10th grader as the Renaissance man, but that's what John was. He knew a little bit about everything, but what he knew most was how to build things. He was a great builder. His father was a shop teacher. And so John took me over to his house and showed me the stuff that he did from kindergarten on. And I could hardly wait for him to meet my Uncle Bill, the old civil engineer and structural engineer. And they hit it off. They were really enjoyed each other's company. And it wasn't too long before they came up with a project. And the project was to take our carport and turn it into a library for my Uncle Bill. It took 6 months, but they did it. It was beautiful. Indirect lighting, carved bookcases, state-of-the-art music. Well, state-of-the-art for 1967, but state-of-the-art music, or sound system. And Bill was surrounded by his music and books. The place wasn't just a refuge for Bill. It was also a place where John and I would come together and talk about philosophic issues. We trusted Bill. We opened up stuff that we never would have opened up with our teachers at Novi High. In fact, we shared with my uncle how bored we were at that high school and loved the things that we were talking about. Bill started to establish kind of institutionalized questions for us, more on the philosophic level. So, what would be like what keeps you moral and ethical? How do you show love? How do you know when somebody is telling you the truth? And we'd have long talks about that. This one day my mother came in. She looked at Bill and said, oh, by the way, we were talking about baseball. But she looked at my uncle and said, you turning them into communists? And then Bill said, I said, Mom, we're talking baseball. I don't know how she did it, but she went from baseball to starting a debate with my uncle about the Vietnam War. This is 1967, the war was raging at that time. Well, anyway, she started to lay out why she was for the Vietnam War. And as time went on, my uncle just dismantled every one of her arguments, and he did it so smoothly and so effortlessly. And usually when they had debates like that, my mother would finally say, okay, I am not going to argue anymore because we're just arguing over ego. And I'm a Christian woman, and I believe that the meek shall inherit the earth. My uncle said, yeah, well, if they do, it'll be in probate for about 1 billion years. So he was able to always end an argument with a joke. But usually I ended arguments by cussing the other person out. I couldn't think that fast. Well, anyway, after my mother left, John said, could you come over to my house, Bill, and argue with my uncle, really argue with my father, really debate him, because all he does is yell at me for being against the Vietnam War. And Bill said, yeah, I could do it. I like a good debate, but you know, what would you learn if I went over to your house and debated your father? I mean, if all you're going to learn is that your father beat me in a debate or I beat your father in a debate, what good is that? What you need to know is how we came to our conclusions, how your father came to his conclusion about the Vietnam War, how I came to my conclusions. That would be instructive. And I said, Bill, you are such a better teacher than those teachers we have at our school. Our school is so boring. And John goes, yeah, Bill, you're right. We shouldn't even go. I hate school. And Bill said, okay, here's the question of the week. Because you guys have told me over and over again that school is boring. So here's your question. What is boredom? You know, when I go out to a movie or go to the mall or something like that, sometimes I ask teenagers, like, give me one word that describes school. And 90% of the time, they say, it's boring. You know, and I ask them, well, why is it boring? And they go, well, because it doesn't interest me. Well, why doesn't it interest you? Well, because it's stupid. Well, why is it stupid? Because it's boring. I mean, you know, you guys gone through this yourself. You know, this is a very typical thing. So I'm going to ask you to do this for the next week. What is boredom? Now, I usually don't do this with you. And I hope that you take this not as a threat, but as a challenge. I mean, when you try to come up with an answer about what is boredom, some of your answers might startle you. You might find out that there is no such thing as a boring subject, just boring people. And boring people are easily bored. And that may not be your fault, but it just might be your problem. And you think it's the teacher's problem. I mean, you guys have convinced yourselves that it's a teacher's problem if you don't know something, especially something that has consequences for how well you live your life. I mean, think about all the waking hours you've gone to school, and you don't seem to learn anything. It's boring, it's stupid, you know, and I could ask you, well, why are you there? And then you go, oh, my mom's making me go. I have to get good grades. I have to go to college and get a good job. You can say all those stuff, but then on the other hand, you go, nobody tells me what to do. I'm an individual. I do what I want to do. Well, you're living in this contradiction. I mean, spending all your youth in a place that you don't want to be, that has no legitimate purpose or value to you. So you become a spectator, and you sit there and try to endure the boredom, thinking that when you get a diploma, that's going to translate into cash, and then everything's going to be fine. There'll be no more boredom. The tragedy is that for most people, it doesn't end. The boredom doesn't end because for most people, they don't know anything more than they did when they were in high school. Now, I'm not saying this to make it sound like, oh, you're going to live a horrible life, woe is you, and that. I know it's more complicated than that. But yeah, I think you're going to have to deal with the real consequences of not knowing. Last thing. I think for most people, and you guys included, most of you think your life is going to be much better than your parents. You don't know how, but it's going to be much better. You think that your parents are not going to be as good as you are going to be. You think that your kids are not going to look at you the way you look at your parents. Don't you think they thought that when they were your age? Okay, looking forward to seeing your answers next week. For John and I, that was an inspiration. But Bill knew that wasn't going to be good enough, because your bad behavior is going to overcome your little moments of inspiration. So Bill opened up that library, and he worked with us, and we started to get better grades. And he made himself available. A lot of times he wasn't available, he was doing other stuff, but he made himself available. We started to learn. My mother always tried to drive through my head when I was in middle school, you're not college material. take the civil service exam. You can't make it. Well, she didn't like the idea that we were spending so much time studying. It was so foreign to her. It was really foreign to us. She then started to change it, saying, I need to take the civil service exam. She now said, okay, you need to join the Army. You need to join the military, and you need to go to Vietnam and do something for your country. The war was raging at this time. I didn't know, even the people who were for the war didn't want to send their kids to war. Maybe some military family-centered family might think that, but most people didn't. And I was always had it in the back of my mind ever since I was old enough to have consciousness that she was trying to kill me. This might be another idea here. Well, anyway, John and I kept on studying. We applied to college. We took our SATs. The next year, my mother got desperate because she saw that my grades were getting better. So she called up the Marine Recruitment Center and had them come to the house and told them that I was ready to go to Vietnam. That's a whole nother story I have to tell you sometime, but I don't have time. But anyway, I wish you could have seen the expression on those recruiters' faces as they walked out after talking to me about the advantages of going to the Vietnam War. Anyway, the next year of 12th grade, the first semester, I got all A's. I never thought, me getting all A's? I got all A's. My life changed immediately. First of all, the Wall Street Journal called me up and wanted to know my opinion on what to invest in for the investment banker. Should it be Polaroid or international business machines? The second thing that happened to me is the Novi News called me up and they wanted me to explain Einstein's theory of relativity to them. There was another call from Brown University, my uncle's alma mater. And they asked me to join the student body. I said, I can't, I didn't graduate from high school yet. They said, forget about that. We need you. That didn't happen. What happened though was that John got accepted to Eastern Michigan University and I didn't get my acceptance letter. The second thing that happened is that my father had lumps on his head and scratches on his arm. And I said, wow, I said, Dad, what happened to you? And he said, oh, it happened at work. I didn't believe it. But I couldn't really focus on his problem because there was a third problem. And the third problem is my Uncle Bill sat me down and said, after you graduate from high school, I'm moving back to New York for good. Now, my uncle flew in 18 years prior to be witness to my birth. And when he flew in, he had no intention of staying. But he had a good look at the family I was born into. And he said, I can't leave you like this. I know what's going to happen to you. So he stayed for 18 years. When he told me he was going to go back, I wanted to throw up. But then that night I started to think about it. He deserves it. I mean, he spent 18 years of his life for me. He should spend the rest of his life doing something he wants to do in a place that he loves so much, New York City. So as March turned into April, he said he was going to go back to New York to get some stuff settled for a smooth transition for himself, and he'd show up a few days before I graduated. So it was a tough time. It was a tough time being with my father and my mother and without Bill. I had to keep on wrapping up boxes and sending them to Bill because he was going to move, and that was a reality that he was going to move. And then one day, I walked out to the mailbox again, like I usually do, and nothing was there. And one day, there was this envelope. And I ran into my bedroom and threw it down on the bed and stared at it. It was from Eastern Michigan University. And it's either going to say you're not accepted or you're accepted. And I stared. Maybe for 15 minutes, maybe for 15 days. I lifted it up and slowly my finger went over the the seal. And I opened it up. And there it was. I was accepted. And I ran into the kitchen, and my mother's at the stove, and she's stirring the soup. And I said, I got accepted! I don't have to be here anymore! I don't have to live with you anymore! I'm free! My mother, do you remember what happened in Wizard of Oz when Dorothy threw the water on the That's what happened. She shriveled up and went down, and she was saying something like that. And then that stopped, and some sticky, smelly ooze came out from under her. And I looked at her face, and there was this sickly purple plumes of gas that went up. And then I looked at the wall where all her religious iconography was. And it all melted down the wall and onto the floor in this toxic stew. That didn't happen. What happened was my mother was looking at me like I was nuts, jumping up and down. She straightened out her wig and came over and said, give me that letter. She looked at it. She said, you just got accepted to a university for losers. This is what your uncle gets you into. Always trying to give you dreams that you can't fulfill. And then all of a sudden, into the room comes my father. And he sits down. And my mother goes, you're drunk! What if you get in an accident? We'll be back in the ghetto, there'll be no way out! She turned up the heat on the soup, stirred it around for a bit, and she picked up a bowl, put it in the bowl, walked over, put it even with his eyes, and then let it drop, bounced off the end of the table, broke in his lap, and there was steam coming out of his crotch area. I ran and got a towel, pulled it back, and then he just pushed me away and went back to his bed. And I said, you were hurting him the entire time. She said, I did nothing of the sort. I said, you did too, you monster. And she said, you think I did that, you're just going to have to stay here and watch. I picked up the acceptance letter. I worked too hard for this letter. And she said, well, I think your uncle's going to be pretty disappointed. You're the one who goes around saying, oh, my Uncle Bill, he did all this for me. He saved my life. He gave up his life for me. And you're not going to give it 2 years for your father? He's going to be very disappointed that he raised such a selfish child. I took the acceptance letter and I walked over into my father's room. He was already sleeping, snoring in the bed. I sat at the edge of the bed and I thought, what should I do? I don't want to leave him with my mother, and I don't want to not go to college. It was already dark when I walked back into the kitchen. My mother was sitting there. I took my acceptance letter and tore it. Threw it down. My mother stood up. Good. Good. I'll call John and tell you you're not going to be coming. So I called my friend John and told him I can't go to college now because I need to take care of my father. For the next 2 weeks, I kept on wanting to call John again and explain more, but I didn't do it. And now it's down to about 3 days before graduation. And all of a sudden I heard somebody one evening coming through the library. It was John. He said, I know you weren't calling me back, so I had to get a guy who could talk some sense into you. And looked over, it's my Uncle Bill. We hugged. And Bill said, I came back because I want to assure that you go to college. And I said, well, I have to take care of my sick father. I don't know what will happen to him if I don't. Does that sound familiar to you, Bill? He said, look, I'm 65. You're 18. I'll be fine. Your father will be fine. you just go to college. So, John and I are hungry, so come on, let's go. Let's get something to eat. Get your father, let's go. Then I go, shall we have some pizza? And then Bill looks at John and goes, I spent 5 weeks in New York City. I come back to Novi, Michigan, and I have pizza. He goes, just get your father. So we went out, had a great year, better than maybe I ever had in my life. When I got home, I sat in bed. I was tired, but I didn't want to go to sleep right away. I just thought about how lucky I was that there was a guy who was willing to give up his life and then come back and do it again. For the first time in my life at 18 years old, I thought I might have a future.